heard that you were going to get spoiled. So how does a restaurant like that big, that loved, that impossible to escape, vanish so completely that most Americans under 40 have never even heard the name? And why did the old man on the sign, the one promising to spoil you, spend his actual life fighting to stop people from doing the exact thing that got done to him? Because the thing that made Beefsteak Charlie's a phenomenon is the exact same thing that killed it. And this one didn't die of bad food or bad management. It died because America changed its mind about something, and Beefsteak Charlie's was standing in the worst possible place when it happened. There are 3 things in this story I genuinely could not believe when I found them. A receipt from 1982, 49 racks of ribs, and $2 million that walked out the door in 1990. Stay with me for all 3. Let's get into it. First, the offer, because you need to understand how absurd this was. You walk into a Beefsteak Charlie's in 1979, and the menu is priced like a diner. Boneless sirloin, $4.99. The old-fashioned beefsteak, $4.79. If you were feeling fancy and wanted the filet mignon, that was $7.99, and that was the expensive one. Run that $4.99 sirloin forward to today, and you're at roughly $22, which is about what a chain restaurant charges you now for a bowl of pasta and an apology. With any of those, you got the salad bar. And the Beefsteak Charlie's salad bar was not a bowl of iceberg lettuce and some shredded carrot going brown at the edges. It had shrimp. Pre-peeled shrimp, so you didn't even have to work for it, sitting there in bowls, and you could go back as many times as you wanted. And then, on top of all of that, you got the beer, or the wine, or the sangria, whichever you preferred, in whatever quantity you preferred, for as long as you were sitting in that chair. The beer was Schaefer, and the wine was Franzia, and nobody was pretending otherwise. You were not getting a Bordeaux. You were getting a pitcher, and then another pitcher, and the entire point, the thing the whole business was built on, was that the waiter never once made you feel cheap for asking. That's why the commercials worked the way they did. The man in the ads was a working character actor from Greenwich Village named Tom Lacey, who had done Broadway, who was in Last of the Red Hot Lovers, and who would later turn up in the Royal Tenenbaums and on Law & Order. And for about a decade, Tom Lacey put on a mustache and an old-time collar and became Beefsteak Charlie, this twinkling, faintly condescending grandfather figure who told you, "I'm Beefsteak Charlie, and you're going to get spoiled with free shrimp." Eventually, they gave him a nephew, Beefsteak Chuck. There was a jingle about everybody going to Beefsteak Charlie's, the place to have a good old time. And if you grew up anywhere near New York in this era, you can probably hear it right now, the whole thing, 40 years later, even though you have not thought about it once since the Reagan administration. Notice what he's actually offering you, though, because he isn't offering you a deal, he's offering to spoil you. The other line they ran was even better, and I want you to hold on to it, because it turns out to be the most accurate slogan in the history of American restaurants. He looked into the camera and said, "I'll feed you like there's no tomorrow." So here's the receipt I promised you. In February of 1982, the Washington Post sent a reviewer out to the Bethesda location, and that reviewer documented, on the record, in a major American newspaper, a family exercising what the paper called no restraint whatever. 7 heaping plates of shrimp cocktail off the salad bar. 3 salads. 2 orders of barbecued chicken. 1 sirloin steak Mediterranean with the garlic sauce. 3 pitchers of soft drink, 1 baked potato, 2 orders of potato chips, and 2 dishes of ice cream. The bill came to $12.49. And they turned down the free beer and wine. They left value on the table. That is how much value there was. Now, that was the machine at full tilt, and it ran like that for years. But to understand why it broke, you have to go to an address in Midtown Manhattan, because Beefsteak Charlie was a real man. He was buried in 1946, and he had absolutely nothing to do with any of this. His name was Charles Chessar, and he was a New York restaurant man his whole working life. He worked Hot Springs, Arkansas, he worked Coney Island. And he put in 8 years at a famous West Side steakhouse called Healy's before he ever opened a door of his own. So this was not a man with a concept. This was a man who had spent decades on his feet in other people's kitchens watching how it was done. Around 1910, he opened his first place in the old Winter Garden building on Broadway. And in 1914, he moved into the address that made him, 216 West 50th Street, between Broadway and 8th Avenue, right underneath the neon. Throw out whatever you're picturing, because the floor was covered in sawdust, and every inch of the walls was papered with enormous photographs of racetrack spills, horses going down at Belmont, jockeys in the air. That was the crowd. Beefsteak Charlie's was where the horse people drank. A columnist named O. McIntyre wrote it up in 1921, and his description does the whole job in a paragraph. No mahogany, no plush carpet, no gold-rimmed china, just walls covered in racing pictures because the place was the rendezvous of the track followers. And the waiters, he said, always had a live one for you for tomorrow at Belmont. Think about that for a second. The waiters were giving out tips, and not on the wine, on the fourth race. Mixed in with the horsemen, you'd find stage people from the Broadway houses, a couple of playwrights, a few businessmen, and the best-known racing editor in the city. A steak that covered your entire plate ran you about 50 cents. The name came from the newspapers, and Charlie told that story himself years later. The boys from the Morning Telegraph threw the first beefsteak party he ever hosted, and their old sports editor, a man named Harry Williams, wrote it up the next day and called him Beefsteak Charlie, and the name stuck. But listen to what he said next, when they asked him why he'd gone and registered it. He said because a lot of the boys tried to steal it. But it's still my name. Remember that. Even the signature dish was an accident. One day at the old Broadway cafe, he ran out of provisions, so he took a beefsteak, clapped 2 slices of white bread around it, and handed it to a customer who looked at him like he'd lost his mind, and that became the specialty of the house. And then the 20th century got hold of him. A fire tore through the place in March of 1933 and destroyed a lot of those racing photographs, the ones you can't replace. Prohibition ended, and the whole culture of the Broadway saloon shifted underneath his feet. His wife, Alice, died in 1934, and in October of that same year, he closed the doors, and the New York Times ran the headline, "Beefsteak Charlie Gives Up Business. Closes West 50th Street Cafe, rendezvous of followers of sports for 20 years. He retired around 1941, and on the 24th of January, 1946, he had a heart attack and died at New Rochelle Hospital at 77 years old. But the room didn't die with him. And this is the part that I cannot get out of my head. A man named William Soshnick took over 216 West 50th Street, and through the 50s and 60s that room turned into something else entirely, a jazz musician's hangout, open until 4 in the morning, functioning as a booking office and a clubhouse and very nearly a hotel for men who had nowhere else to be at 3 a.m. And to keep them there, Soshnick ran a deal on the beer. Order 2, get 1 free. So sit with the timeline. 1950-something at Charlie Chessar's old address, decades before Larry Ellman had the idea, before the salad bar, before the shrimp, before Tom Lacey put on the mustache, somebody was already using free beer to hold a room full of people in their chairs. The idea was born in that building. Nobody had to invent it. Somebody just had to come back and find it. And 30 years after they buried Charlie, somebody went looking for a corpse. Meet Lawrence Ellman. In 1949, Larry Ellman put $2,000 into Coca-Cola vending machines, and that's the whole origin story. vending machines. He sold that business in 1958 and opened a steakhouse on Lexington Avenue called the Cattleman. Except the Cattleman wasn't a steakhouse, it was a dude ranch that happened to serve steak, with sing-alongs and free stagecoach rides, actual stagecoaches, in Midtown Manhattan. By 1967, it was clearing over $4 million a year. Time magazine profiled him in 1969 and got him in one phrase, saying Larry Ellman was a master at putting the sizzle ahead of the steak, with a gift for appealing to the graduates of Howard Johnson's, which sounds like an insult, and is actually the key to this entire story. Ellman understood that most Americans were quietly terrified of nice restaurants, that they didn't know which fork to use and didn't want to be watched while they figured it out. So he built rooms where it was impossible for anybody to look down on you, and then he gave you a show on top of it. He took over the old, respectable Longchamps chain and started gutting those elegant rooms and converting them into a casual concept called Steak and Brew. Unlimited salad, unlimited beer, cheap steak. Sound familiar? Steak and Brew was the prototype, and in the fall of 1975, it filed for Chapter 11. So picture where Larry Ellman is standing. He's holding a bankrupt chain of steak restaurants, he still believes in the concept, and he has a name that's now radioactive. He needs a better one, something with a story already baked into it. So he goes digging through New York restaurant history, and he finds the dead man. Charles Chessar had registered that name, exactly like he said he did, and he'd fought off the boys who tried to take it. But Chessar had been in the ground for 30 years by then, and no trademark survives that kind of neglect. Nobody owned Beefsteak Charlie's. So Larry Ellman took it. In early 1976, the Steak and Brew locations reopened as Beefsteak Charlie's, and that March he filed the trademark. And when they registered the artwork, that smiling old-timer with the handlebar mustache, they filed it with a legal disclaimer stating that the portrait does not represent any living individual. Which was technically and precisely and beautifully true, and it worked like nothing else on the East Coast. The early stores were in Lawrence, Huntington, Merrick, and Brooklyn, and by the end of the 70s, the chain was pushing 60 locations. It spread through the New York metro area, out into New Jersey and Connecticut and Pennsylvania, up into Maryland with stores in Bethesda and Greenbelt and Frederick, and all the way down to Florida, including one at the airport in Miami Springs. A lot of those rooms had live entertainment, comedy nights, live music, talent shows where the customers got up and sang, all of it engineered to keep you in that chair a little longer, ordering a little more. Which, if you were paying attention a minute ago, is precisely what a man named Soshnick was doing on West 50th Street 20 years earlier with a 2-for-1 on Schaefer. And people did what people always do when you hand them a bottomless anything. There was a stretch when the chain ran an all-you-can-eat rib deal for $9.99, and there's a guy who's written about being a teenager in New Jersey in the mid-'80s, and he and his friends had house rules for it. 1 plate of shrimp first, then 1 plate of salad, then 1 roll, and only then were you permitted to start on the ribs. His personal record was 42 racks. A friend of his got to 49, and they asked the waiters to leave the bones on the table so they could keep count, and told them they were building a cow. 49 racks of ribs for $9.99. That's the second thing I promised you, and if you're enjoying this, hit subscribe, because the third one is the one that made me angry. Now that story is hilarious when you're 17 and it's a fire alarm when you're the accountant, but here's what Larry Ellman understood better than anybody, and it's the reason the whole thing worked in the first place. Most people don't abuse it. Most people have 1 plate of shrimp and 2 beers and go home feeling like royalty. The generosity is a marketing cost. The ordinary tables quietly subsidize the maniacs, and the maniacs go tell everybody they know. That math holds. It holds beautifully, for years, right up until the moment the world changes underneath you. In 1984, it changed. That year was the peak 68 locations, the most Beefsteak Charlies that would ever exist at one time, the commercials everywhere, the jingle stuck in everybody's head. In 1985, the parent company even gave itself a shiny new name, Lifestyle Restaurants, which is exactly what companies do right before things go sideways. But something had already started hundreds of miles from any salad bar, and it had nothing to do with steak and everything to do with what was in the picture. In 1980, a woman named Candace Leitner lost her 13-year-old daughter to a drunk driver, and she started an organization called Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Within 4 years, MAD had done something that almost nobody ever manages to do. It changed how an entire country felt about a normal thing. And you have to understand what normal meant, because the America that Beefsteak Charlie's was built for did not think of drinking and driving as a crime. It was a bad habit, it was a punchline, Andy Griffith had a town drunk. It was the sort of thing you got a stern talking to about. And then, in the space of maybe 5 years, it became one of the most socially unacceptable things a person could do in the United States. On the 17th of July, 1984, President Reagan signed the National Minimum Drinking Age Act, which didn't technically force anybody to do anything. It just said that any state which didn't raise its drinking age to 21 would lose 10% of its federal highway money. Every single state folded. New York went to 21 on the 1st of December, 1985, and by 1988, the whole country was in line. At the same time, courts and legislatures were expanding something called dram shop liability, which in plain English means that if your restaurant serves somebody too much and that person gets in a car and hurts someone, you can be sued. Not the driver. You, the restaurant. And the insurance industry looked at all of that and did what the insurance industry always does. Which is why the mid-'80s brought a full-blown liquor liability insurance crisis with premiums going vertical. So go back and read the slogan, "I'll feed you like there's no tomorrow." Beefsteak Charlie's had built an entire national identity on unlimited alcohol at the precise historical moment that America decided unlimited alcohol was a public menace, and that the person holding the pitcher was legally on the hook for whatever happened next. New York would eventually ban this kind of promotion outright, and fixed-price unlimited drink deals are still illegal there today. One former employee summed the whole thing up better than I can, saying the concept became outdated as the all-you-can-drink part became a huge liability. Now I want to be straight with you, because I went looking and I couldn't find it. There doesn't appear to be a newspaper article sitting anywhere I can reach that says, on this exact date, Beefsteak Charlie's ended the free drinks, and here's the executive explaining why. So I'm not going to invent one for you. But you don't need the memo, because you can read it in the numbers. By 1987, Beefsteak Charlie's had closed 20 locations and lost $20 million since 1984, and 68 was down to 48. And the drinks weren't the only wound. The chain had grown fast, and fast growth in restaurants means the same thing every time, which is that the good managers get spread too thin, the kitchens drift. And the place you loved in 1979 is not quite the place you walk into in 1986. You can't put your finger on why, you just stop going as often. Food costs were climbing at the same time, including on shrimp, which was the one thing on that salad bar people actually crossed town for, and by then everybody had copied the idea, so you had Sizzler and Ponderosa, and Bonanza, and Steak and Ale pushing 280 locations, and Red Lobster, all of them running a cheap steak and a bottomless bowl of greens at the same price. On the other side, you had the new casual chains like TGI, Fridays pulling away the younger crowd who wanted a scene instead of a salad bar. So strip out the free beer. And ask yourself what Beefsteak Charlie's actually is at that point. It's Sizzler with a mustache. That's the trap, and that's the answer to the question I asked you at the start. The one thing that made it different was the one thing it could no longer afford to do. Which brings us to 1987 and the part where this stops being sad and starts being ugly. Lifestyle Restaurants got bought by a company called Bombay Palace Restaurants, an Indian restaurant group built by a man named Sant Singh Chatwal, who would later become a major hotelier and a prominent political fundraiser. It was a stock deal reported at $8.4 million, and I'll be honest that the sourcing gets muddy, because most accounts put the merger in August of 1987, while there's also a New York Times company brief from the 21st of February. Announced in February, closed in August is the likely answer, but I haven't confirmed it, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. What's confirmed is what happened next, which is that Bombay Palace did not save Beefsteak Charlie's, because Bombay Palace was drowning too. In 1989, it went into bankruptcy protection, partly to stop the Internal Revenue Service from seizing restaurants over unpaid taxes, and by then Beefsteak Charlie's was down to 35 locations. And in 1990, the Securities and Exchange Commission filed a case against Bombay Palace, its former finance chief, and Sant Singh as chairman. The allegation, according to reporting on the court records, was that Bombay had taken $2 million out of Lifestyle Restaurants, the company it had just bought, in order to prop up its own financial results. $2 million. Now that's an abstraction, it's a number on a page, so let me put it in the only currency this story actually deals in. That family in Bethesda, the ones who ate 7 plates of shrimp and 2 chickens and a steak and walked out for $12.49? $2 million is about 160,000 of those dinners. 160,000 Friday nights. 160,000 times somebody sat down in a vinyl booth and got handed more than they paid for. That's what allegedly got moved across a ledger to make a balance sheet look prettier. The case was settled the same day it was filed. No financial penalty. The defendants simply agreed not to violate securities laws again. Beefsteak Charlie spent its entire life spoiling other people. At the end, somebody spoiled themselves with it. If you ate at one of these, I want to know which location, and I want to know what you got away with. Put it in the comments, I read them. Bombay Palace came out of bankruptcy in 1991. Beefsteak Charlie's didn't come out of anything, it just got smaller. By 1992 there were 2 locations left advertising in Manhattan, one at 51st and Broadway in the old Lindy's spot, and one at 45th and 8th Avenue. Around the year 2000, that 45th Street room got turned into Joe Franklin's Memory Lane restaurant, which is almost too perfect a name for what was happening to it. The 8th Avenue location inside the Howard Johnson's Plaza Hotel closed shortly after September 11, 2001 because Midtown emptied out and a restaurant living on tourist traffic couldn't survive that. The last threads are gone somewhere around 2004, and nobody can give you the exact day, because by then, nobody was writing it down. There were revivals. Of course there were. The trademark got re-registered in 2001, and in March of 2003 somebody advertised a Beefsteak Charlie's in Elmsford, New York attached to a Wellesley Inn. In 2009, another one opened in the Westfield Sunrise Mall in Massapequa, and it closed almost immediately under a pile of bad reviews. Because you can buy the name. You cannot buy 1979. Larry Ellman, the vending machine kid who put stagecoaches in Midtown and dug up a dead man's restaurant, died in 2013 at Mount Sinai at 86. Tom Lacey, the man in the mustache, the man who promised to spoil you, died in 2020. And yet the thing refuses to leave. Todd Rundgren put a Beefsteak Charlie's reference in the opening of a song on his 1976 album, which makes a lot more sense once you learn his drummer in Utopia was Kevin Ellman, Larry's son. On Friends, in 1998, a drunk Chandler slurs out a line about getting hammered at Beefsteak Charlie's. It shows up on Will and Grace, and on Entourage somebody complains that they ain't got a Beefsteak Charlie's out here. It's in the Goldbergs, it's in Maniac, there's a Beefsteak Charlie's billboard in Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, and in 2024 John Cena's character claims he had a job peeling shrimp at one. A chain that's been dead for 20 years, and writers keep reaching for it because if you say Beefsteak Charlie's to a certain kind of American, something happens in their chest. And it isn't the food, let's be honest about the food. It was a Schaefer, a Franzia, and a piece of sirloin that cost $4.99 for a reason. What people miss is the feeling of being handed more than they paid for, of a waiter walking over with another pitcher and not making a face about it, of being 17 and stacking rib bones on a table and being told to go ahead and build the cow, of being a family that couldn't really afford a night out, eating $12.49 worth of shrimp anyway, and walking out into that parking lot feeling wealthy. That's the product. The steak was just how they delivered it. And Charlie Chessar knew it first. He put sawdust on the floor and racing pictures on the walls and had his waiters slip you a tip for the fourth race, and he charged you 50 cents, and the reason people loved that room had nothing to do with beef either. Then Soshnik kept it going with a free beer at 3 in the morning in the same